The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace. Queen Camilla walked with measured steps, her cream-colored dress flowing gently in the autumn breeze. Today was different from any other day. Leaders from 40 nations were gathering for the Global Climate Summit, and the palace was buzzing with activity. Security personnel stood at every corner, their faces stern and professional. Among them was Officer James Whitmore, a royal guard with 15 years of service. He had always been proud of his position, standing tall in his traditional uniform, protecting the royal family and their guests. But today, something inside him felt heavy. Camilla paused near the West Wing entrance, adjusting her pearl necklace. She noticed the increased tension in the air. Diplomatic cars were arriving one after another, carrying presidents, prime ministers, and dignitaries from every continent. The weight of the world seemed to rest on this single day. Inside the palace, King Charles was reviewing his speech for the summit. His hands trembled slightly as he held the papers. The doctors had warned him to take things slowly, but duty called. He had spent months preparing for this moment, hoping to unite world leaders on the urgent matter of climate change. Officer Whitmore shifted his weight from one foot to another. His mind wandered to a conversation he had overheard earlier that morning. Two senior advisors were discussing security concerns, mentioning a potential breach in protocol. Something about unauthorized access to restricted areas during the summit. He had tried to report it through proper channels, but his concerns were dismissed. The Queen continued her walk, greeting staff members with warm smiles. She had learned over the years that kindness could open doors that power could not. Her relationship with the palace staff was built on mutual respect, something she valued deeply. As noon approached, the first wave of world leaders began arriving. The German chancellor stepped out of her vehicle, followed by the Prime Minister of Japan. Cameras flashed from every direction. Media personnel from hundreds of news organizations crowded behind the barriers, capturing every moment. Camilla stood near the grand entrance, ready to welcome the guests alongside other members of the royal family. Her role was not just ceremonial. She understood the importance of making each leader feel valued and heard. Years of public service had taught her the art of diplomacy. Officer Whitmore watched from his post near the security checkpoint. His unease grew with each passing minute. He noticed something odd about one of the catering vans that had entered through the service gate. The driver's credentials seemed legitimate, but something about his behavior raised red flags. The Queen noticed the guard's troubled expression. She had always been observant, picking up on subtle changes in people's demeanor. Years of royal duties had sharpened her ability to read faces and body language. She made a mental note to check on the young officer later. Inside the main hall, preparations were reaching their final stages. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above rows of seats arranged for the summit. Each place setting bore the flag of a represented nation. The stage was set for what many hoped would be a historic gathering. King Charles emerged from his study, his private secretary walking beside him. Despite his health concerns, the king looked determined and focused. He greeted the early arrivals with genuine warmth, discussing shared concerns about the planet's future. His passion for environmental causes had defined much of his public life. Camilla joined her husband, standing by his side as they welcomed the President of France. The formalities were observed with precision, but there was also genuine connection in their conversations. These were not just diplomatic pleasantries. Real relationships were being built. Officer Whitmore made a decision. He could not ignore his instincts. He approached his commanding officer once more, insisting that the suspicious van needed to be inspected. This time his urgency caught attention. A team was dispatched to investigate. The Queen excused herself from the receiving line for a moment. She walked toward the security area, her intuition guiding her. Something was not right, and she trusted her feelings. Years of public service had taught her to never ignore that inner voice. As she approached, she saw Officer Whitmore standing rigid, clearly distressed. The young guard was speaking rapidly to his superiors, pointing toward the service entrance. His face showed a mixture of frustration and concern. The investigation of the van revealed nothing immediately dangerous, but several items were found that did not match the catering manifest. Security protocols were tightened instantly. The summit could not be compromised. Camilla observed the situation unfold from a distance. She saw how Officer Whitmore's persistence had potentially prevented a security issue. She also noticed how his superiors were now treating him differently, taking his concerns seriously. The afternoon session was about to begin. World leaders gathered in the main hall, taking their seats. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Climate scientists, activists, and policymakers filled the gallery. This summit had the potential to shape environmental policy for decades to come. King Charles stepped up to the podium. His voice was steady as he began his opening address. He spoke of shared responsibility, of the legacy they would leave for future generations. His words carried the weight of genuine concern and hope. Camilla listened from her seat in the front row. She felt proud of her husband's commitment, but also worried about his health. She noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way he paused to catch his breath. Only she could see these small signs that others might miss. Officer Whitmore had been asked to remain on duty in the main hall. His earlier vigilance had earned him recognition from the security chief. He stood at attention, but his mind was still processing the morning's events. He wondered if he had done enough, if there were other threats he had missed. The Queen's eyes met the guards across the room. In that brief moment, she saw a young man carrying a heavy burden. She saw dedication and doubt mixed together. She knew that feeling well. The weight of duty was something she understood deeply. As the first speaker concluded their presentation, applause filled the hall. The summit was proceeding smoothly. Outside, protesters gathered peacefully, holding signs calling for stronger climate action. Their voices added to the importance of the discussions happening inside. The day was far from over. More speeches would follow, more discussions, more negotiations. But something had already shifted. A small act of vigilance by one guard had potentially protected everyone present, and a queen had noticed. Evening fell over London, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The first day of the Global Climate Summit had concluded successfully. World leaders retreated to their accommodations, their minds full of proposals and compromises. But inside Buckingham Palace, the real drama was just beginning. Queen Camilla stood in the private sitting room, reviewing the day's events with her personal staff. She could not shake the image of Officer Whitmore's troubled face from her mind. Something about his situation bothered her deeply. She had seen too many dedicated people ignored when they tried to do the right thing. The king entered the room, loosening his tie with a tired gesture. The day had taken its toll on him. His face showed exhaustion but also satisfaction. The summit's opening had gone better than expected. Several nations had already pledged stronger commitments to reducing emissions. Camilla poured him a cup of tea, a simple ritual they had shared for years. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the weight of the day. Outside their window, security lights illuminated the palace grounds. Guards continued their rotations, ever watchful. Officer Whitmore was relieved from his post at midnight. He walked to the staff quarters, his mind racing. The security chief had briefly thanked him for his vigilance, but something felt incomplete. He had followed protocol, raised concerns, and potentially prevented a serious incident. Yet he felt no satisfaction, only lingering worry. The next morning arrived with unexpected news. The media had somehow learned about the security incident with the catering van. Headlines speculated about potential threats to the summit. The palace communications team scrambled to control the narrative, issuing carefully worded statements. Camilla read the morning papers with growing concern. She knew how quickly stories could spiral out of control. More importantly, she wondered how Officer Whitmore was handling the attention. Guards were trained to remain invisible, to do their duty without recognition or scrutiny. Suddenly, his actions were being analyzed by the entire world. King Charles attended an early breakfast meeting with security advisors. They discussed enhanced protocols for the remaining summit days. The king listened carefully, asking pointed questions about gaps in their systems. He wanted to ensure that good officers like Whitmore felt heard and valued. The second day of the summit focused on renewable energy initiatives. Presentations from various nations showcased innovative technologies and ambitious targets. The atmosphere in the conference hall was more relaxed than the previous day. Leaders were beginning to find common ground. During a morning break, Camilla decided to take an unusual step. She requested a private meeting with the head of palace security. Her staff raised eyebrows at the request, but arrangements were made. The Queen rarely intervened directly in security matters, preferring to trust the experts. But this situation felt different. In the security office, Commander Sarah Pembroke stood as the Queen entered. The commander was a veteran with 30 years of service, known for her strict adherence to protocol. She was surprised by the Queen's visit but maintained her professional composure. Camilla got straight to the point. She wanted to know more about Officer Whitmore's concerns and how they had been handled. Commander Pembroke explained the chain of events, defending her team's initial response. They had followed standard procedures, she insisted. The threat assessment had been completed correctly. The Queen listened without interrupting. When the commander finished, Camilla asked a simple question that changed everything. Had anyone actually spoken with Officer Whitmore about what he saw, beyond just collecting his report? Had anyone asked why his instincts had been triggered? Commander Pembroke hesitated. The honest answer was no. Reports had been filed, procedures had been followed, but no one had taken the time for a real conversation with the young guard. In the rush of summit preparations, he had been just another cog in the security machine. Camilla thanked the commander and left. As she walked through the corridors, her mind was made up. Sometimes the smallest voices carried the most important messages. Sometimes the people on the ground saw things that others missed. She would not let Officer Whitmore's vigilance go unacknowledged. Meanwhile, Officer Whitmore reported for his afternoon shift. Other guards treated him differently now. Some offered congratulations. Others seemed resentful of the attention he had received. He felt isolated, caught between praise and suspicion. He had only done his job, yet somehow it had become complicated. The summit continued with discussions on forest conservation. The Brazilian delegation presented ambitious plans for protecting the Amazon. Other nations pledged financial support. Hope filled the conference hall as real commitments began to take shape. King Charles watched with quiet satisfaction. His life's work seemed to be bearing fruit, but he also noticed his wife's distracted demeanor. He knew that look. Camilla was working through something, planning some action that others might not understand until it was done. During the afternoon tea break, world leaders mingled in the palace gardens. Cameras captured handshakes and smiling conversations. Behind the scenes, diplomats negotiated the fine details of agreements. Every word and every document mattered. Camilla made her way to the East Garden where a smaller gathering was taking place. She engaged in polite conversation with the Prime Minister of Canada, discussing shared interests in environmental protection. But her mind kept returning to the young guard who had shown such dedication. As evening approached, preparations began for the summit's formal dinner. The state dining room had been transformed into a magnificent setting. Crystal gleamed under candlelight. Each table setting represented hours of careful planning. This dinner would be remembered for years to come. Officer Whitmore was assigned to door duty during the dinner. He would stand guard outside the dining room, ensuring no unauthorized persons entered. It was a prestigious post, usually reserved for senior guards. The assignment felt like both an honor and a burden. Guests began arriving in formal attire. The Queen wore a stunning emerald gown that complemented her natural elegance. She greeted each arrival with genuine warmth, remembering names and previous conversations. Her gift for making people feel valued was on full display. King Charles stood beside her, looking distinguished in his formal evening wear. Despite his fatigue, he projected strength and purpose. This summit was more than a diplomatic gathering. It represented hope for the planet's future and his legacy as monarch. The dinner proceeded with multiple courses and carefully planned seating arrangements. Conversations flowed across language barriers facilitated by skilled interpreters. Laughter mixed with serious discussions. Relationships were being forged that would shape international policy. Outside the dining room, Officer Whitmore maintained his post. He could hear the muffled sounds of conversation and clinking glasses. He stood alone with his thoughts, reflecting on the strange turn his career had taken. He had joined the Royal Guard to serve with honor, not to become a news story. Camilla excused herself briefly from the dinner, citing a need to check on arrangements for the next day. She walked through the corridors with purpose, her gown trailing behind her. Staff members bowed as she passed, but she barely noticed. Her focus was elsewhere. She found Officer Whitmore at his post. He snapped to attention, surprised to see the Queen outside the formal dinner. She smiled gently and asked if they could speak privately for a moment. The guard's confusion was evident, but he followed proper protocol. They stepped into a small antechamber nearby. Camilla's expression was kind but serious. She thanked him for his service and his vigilance. She told him that good instincts and courage to speak up were rare qualities. She wanted him to know that his actions mattered, that he had been seen and appreciated. Officer Whitmore was speechless. He had not expected this. Queens did not typically seek out junior guards for private conversations. He managed to thank her, his voice catching slightly. The weight he had been carrying seemed to lift a bit. Camilla returned to the dinner and the guard resumed his post. But something had changed. A queen had taken time from the world's most important gathering to recognize one person's dedication. The gesture was small in the grand scheme of international diplomacy, but it meant everything to the young officer. The third morning of the summit brought unexpected developments. Officer Whitmore arrived for his shift to find that his story had grown beyond palace walls. International media outlets were praising his dedication, calling him a symbol of vigilance in uncertain times. His photograph appeared in newspapers across Europe and Asia. The attention made him uncomfortable. He was a private person who valued the anonymity his uniform provided. Now strangers recognized his face. Fellow guards had mixed reactions. Some felt proud. Others believed he was receiving too much credit for simply doing his job. Queen Camilla read the morning coverage with interest. She understood the power of symbols in public discourse. Officer Whitmore had become more than just a guard. He represented the everyday heroes who kept society safe, the people who spoke up when something seemed wrong. She saw an opportunity to reinforce an important message. King Charles was scheduled to deliver the summit's keynote address that afternoon. His speech would outline a comprehensive plan for international cooperation on climate action. He had worked with advisors for weeks, refining every paragraph. This was his moment to inspire real change. But the king woke that morning feeling weaker than usual. His doctors had examined him the previous night, expressing concern about his stress levels. They recommended rest, but Charles refused. Too much was at stake. He took his medication and pushed forward. Camilla noticed her husband's pale complexion at breakfast. She knew the signs of his struggling health. Years of marriage had taught her to read his silences, to understand what he would never openly admit. She worried, but she also knew he would never agree to step back from his responsibilities. The morning session focused on ocean conservation. Scientists presented alarming data about rising sea levels and dying coral reefs. Island nations spoke passionately about their existential threats. The reality of climate change filled the room with urgency. During a break, Commander Pembroke approached the Queen with a request. Media outlets were asking for interviews with Officer Whitmore. Should they allow it? The palace typically kept guards out of the spotlight, but this situation was different. The commander wanted guidance. Camilla considered the question carefully. She asked if Officer Whitmore wanted to do interviews. The commander admitted they had not asked him. The Queen smiled slightly. That, she said, was the answer. They should ask him what he wanted. Not tell him, not decide for him. Ask him. Officer Whitmore was called to the security office. Commander Pembroke explained the situation with more warmth than she usually showed. She asked his preference. The guard thought for a moment before declining politely. He appreciated the recognition but believed his duty was to serve quietly. Speaking to media would feel like seeking attention he had not earned. The commander respected his choice and informed the palace communications team. The Queen heard the decision and nodded approvingly. Character revealed itself in such moments. Officer Whitmore understood something that many in public life forgot. True service required no applause. Lunch was served in the palace gardens. World leaders mingled informally, building relationships beyond the conference room. The Japanese Prime Minister discussed technology sharing with the German Chancellor. African leaders coordinated positions on climate financing. Real progress was happening in these unscripted moments. Camilla circulated through the gathering, facilitating connections. She introduced leaders who shared common interests, suggested topics for bilateral discussions, and smoothed over minor misunderstandings. Her decades of diplomatic experience made her invaluable in these settings. King Charles appeared for lunch but ate little. He listened more than he spoke, conserving his energy for the afternoon address. Several leaders approached to thank him for convening the summit. They recognized his genuine passion for environmental causes. His advocacy over the years had built credibility that political leaders often lacked. As 2 o'clock approached, guests returned to the conference hall. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Everyone knew the king's speech would be significant. His words would be analyzed and debated for weeks to come. The pressure was immense. Backstage, Charles reviewed his notes one final time. His hands shook slightly as he held the papers. Camilla stood beside him, offering quiet support. She straightened his tie and smoothed his jacket. Their eyes met, communicating what words could not express. Worry, love, and unwavering support passed between them. The announcement came. King Charles was introduced to sustained applause. He walked to the podium with measured steps, each movement requiring concentration. He gripped the lectern to steady himself and looked out at the assembled world leaders. He began speaking, his voice stronger than his body felt. He spoke of his lifelong commitment to environmental protection. He recalled warnings from scientists decades ago that were dismissed as alarmist. He acknowledged the failures of previous generations to act decisively. His honesty was refreshing. The king outlined a bold vision for international cooperation. He proposed specific mechanisms for accountability, for technology transfer, for financing the transition to clean energy. His proposals were detailed and practical, the result of years of study and consultation. This was not empty rhetoric. This was a roadmap. As he spoke, his passion animated his words. He leaned forward, making eye contact with different sections of the audience. He spoke of grandchildren inheriting a damaged planet. He challenged leaders to think beyond electoral cycles and national interests. The moment demanded courage, he declared. History would judge their actions. Camilla watched from the front row, her hands clasped tightly. She saw the tremor in his fingers, the way he gripped the podium for support. She noticed when he paused to catch his breath, disguising it as dramatic emphasis. Only she knew how much this speech was costing him physically. The king spoke for 40 minutes, longer than originally planned. He could not stop once he found his rhythm. The words flowed from deep conviction. He spoke of future generations, of moral responsibility, of the legacy they would leave. His voice cracked with emotion at times, making his sincerity undeniable. When he finished, the room erupted in standing ovation. World leaders rose to their feet, applauding not just his words but his evident dedication. Some had tears in their eyes. The moment transcended politics and diplomacy. Something genuine had been shared. Charles stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed by the response. He had poured everything into that speech. Every fear, every hope, every ounce of remaining strength. As he walked off stage, his legs nearly gave way. Only quick thinking by security personnel prevented a fall. Camilla rushed to his side immediately. She took his arm, steadying him with her presence. She whispered that he had been magnificent, that his words had touched everyone. Charles managed a weak smile. He had done what he needed to do. Now his body was demanding payment for pushing beyond its limits. Medical staff were called discreetly. The king was taken to a private room for examination. His blood pressure was elevated, his heart rate irregular. Doctors insisted he rest for the remainder of the day. Charles protested weakly but had no strength to resist. Camilla stayed with him, holding his hand as doctors worked. She felt the familiar fear that came with his health crises. She had faced this before, but it never got easier. The man she loved was fighting his own body, and all she could do was be present. Outside the medical room, palace staff whispered anxiously. The summit could not lose its host at this critical moment. Communications advisors drafted contingency plans. How would they explain if the king could not continue? What message would that send to the assembled leaders? Commander Pembroke doubled security around the medical area. No media could learn about this situation. The summit's success depended on maintaining confidence and momentum. A health crisis would dominate news coverage, overshadowing the important work being accomplished. Officer Whitmore, unaware of the drama unfolding, continued his assigned duties. He stood guard at a perimeter checkpoint, checking credentials and scanning for threats. His earlier vigilance had been validated, but he felt no pride. Just the weight of responsibility that came with keeping people safe. As evening fell, word spread quietly among senior staff that the king would not attend the dinner that night. The official explanation was fatigue from his speech and a need for rest. Most accepted this without question. Only a few knew the truth about how close Charles had come to collapse. Camilla faced a difficult decision. She could cancel her own appearance at the dinner to stay with her husband, or she could attend representing the crown and maintaining normalcy. Charles, resting but conscious, insisted she go. The summit needed visible royal support. She agreed reluctantly, knowing her duty. She changed into evening wear with heavy heart. Her lady-in-waiting noticed the queen's distress but said nothing. Some burdens were carried alone, even in palaces surrounded by staff. The dinner proceeded with polite explanations for the king's absence. Camilla performed her role flawlessly, showing no sign of inner turmoil. She chatted warmly with guests, proposed toasts, and ensured every leader felt valued. No one watching would guess that her husband lay ill just floors above. The fourth day dawned with heavy rain over London. Dark clouds matched the somber mood inside Buckingham Palace. King Charles had spent a restless night, his condition stable but not improved. Doctors recommended he withdraw from the summit entirely. He refused to consider it. Queen Camilla had barely slept. She sat in a chair beside his bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Morning light filtered through the curtains, revealing the exhaustion on both their faces. They had weathered many storms together, but this felt different. More precarious, the summit agenda for the day focused on climate financing. Developing nations would present their needs while wealthy countries debated their commitments. These discussions often became contentious, touching raw nerves about historical responsibility and current capacity. The king's absence would be felt. Officer Whitmore reported for duty with no knowledge of the crisis. He had been reassigned to interior palace security, closer to the private royal apartments. The promotion was unexpected but welcome. His superiors were beginning to trust him with more sensitive responsibilities. Commander Pembroke briefed her senior team about the king's condition in strict confidence. They needed to prepare for multiple scenarios. If Charles could not continue, contingency plans must be ready. But they could not let worry show. Guards must project calm confidence at all times. Camilla met with palace advisors to discuss options. Could the summit continue successfully without the king's visible presence? Would leaders interpret his absence as lack of commitment? The political implications were complex and far-reaching. Every decision carried weight. One advisor suggested Camilla could deliver remarks on the king's behalf. She had the respect of the assembled leaders and understood the issues deeply. It was not traditional, but these were not traditional times. The queen considered the proposal carefully. She visited Charles in his room to discuss the idea. He lay propped against pillows, looking fragile but alert. When she explained the suggestion, his eyes filled with emotion. He had spent decades building credibility on environmental issues. Now his body betrayed him at the crucial moment. Charles told his wife that she should speak. She understood his vision and could articulate it as well as he could. Perhaps better, he admitted with a sad smile. She had a gift for connecting with people that he sometimes lacked. The summit needed that connection now. Camilla felt the weight of his trust. She had supported his work for years, but always from the background. Now she would step forward to speak about his life's passion. The responsibility felt enormous. She must honor his vision while finding her own authentic voice. The morning session began with presentations from small island nations facing existential threats from rising seas. Their pleas were heartbreaking and urgent. The Maldives president showed photographs of communities already being displaced. The Tuvalu representative spoke of watching his homeland slowly disappear. World leaders listened in uncomfortable silence. The human cost of climate change was undeniable in these testimonies. Theoretical discussions about carbon targets became painfully real when faced with people losing their countries. Several delegates wiped away tears. During a break, news began circulating quietly that the Queen would address the conference that afternoon. Speculation grew about the king's condition. Was this a planned speech or an emergency substitution? Palace communications remained carefully vague, feeding curiosity. Camilla spent the late morning preparing. She reviewed the king's notes but knew she could not simply read his words. She needed to speak from her own experience and understanding. She sat at a desk, writing and rewriting, searching for the right approach. Officer Whitmore stood guard outside the private apartments. He could hear movement inside, urgent conversations and occasional medical equipment being moved. He understood something serious was happening but asked no questions. His job was to protect, not to know. Lunch was a subdued affair. The morning testimonies had dampened spirits. Leaders pushed food around their plates, their thoughts clearly elsewhere. The German chancellor spoke quietly with the French president about increasing their climate pledges. The mood was shifting toward greater commitment. At 1 o'clock, palace staff prepared the conference hall for the Queen's address. Her appearance was now confirmed officially. The king would not attend due to health concerns, they announced. He sent his apologies and his full support for the summit's continued work. The statement was brief and dignified. Camilla dressed carefully, choosing a deep blue suit that projected authority and calm. Her stylist suggested jewelry that would photograph well but not distract. Every detail mattered. She would be speaking not just to the room, but to the world watching through cameras. She visited Charles one more time before going downstairs. He was awake, having insisted on watching her speech on television. He took her hand, his grip weak but steady. He told her she would be wonderful. She had always been his strength, he said. Now the world would see what he had always known. The words stayed with her as she walked toward the conference hall. Staff members lined the corridors, offering encouraging smiles. They understood the significance of this moment. The Queen was stepping into an unfamiliar role at a critical time. Everyone hoped she would succeed. World leaders had reassembled, curiosity evident on their faces. The Queen was known for her diplomatic skills and warmth, but she had never delivered a major policy address. Some wondered if she possessed the depth of knowledge needed. Others simply felt sympathy for the difficult position she faced. Camilla was introduced with appropriate formality. She walked to the podium with steady steps, showing no outward nervousness. She placed her notes down and looked up at the assembled leaders. She took a breath and began speaking. She opened with honesty. She acknowledged this was not how she expected to address them. She spoke of the king's disappointment at being unable to continue. But she emphasized that the work transcended any one person. The planet's future depended on their collective will and action. She spoke personally about decades of watching her husband advocate for environmental protection. She recalled the skepticism he faced, the ridicule from some quarters. She remembered when concern for the environment was considered eccentric rather than essential. She had witnessed his lonely struggle become mainstream urgency. The Queen shared observations from her own charitable work. She had seen poverty made worse by environmental degradation. She had met farmers whose land had become barren from drought. She had spoken with mothers worried about their children's future. Climate change was not abstract. It was real and immediate for billions of people. She spoke about privilege and responsibility. She acknowledged the comfort of her own life while recognizing that those least responsible for climate change suffered most from its effects. She called this injustice intolerable. Wealthy nations had moral obligations, not just political interests. Some things transcended economics. Camilla outlined specific proposals, building on her husband's speech. She suggested expanded technology sharing agreements. She proposed debt relief tied to environmental protection. She advocated for prioritizing the most vulnerable nations in climate adaptation funding. Her proposals were concrete and thoughtful. She spoke for 30 minutes, holding the room's complete attention. Her delivery was less dramatic than the king's had been, but equally powerful. Where he had passion, she offered compassion. Where he challenged, she invited. Different approaches, but the same ultimate goal. As she concluded, she made a direct appeal. She asked leaders to imagine explaining their decisions to their grandchildren. Would they say they had done enough? Would they say they had shown courage when it mattered? Or would they admit they had known what was right but lacked the will to act? The choice was theirs alone. The ovation that followed was genuine and prolonged. Leaders stood, many visibly moved by her words. She had connected with them in a way that felt deeply human. This was not just another political speech. It was a heartfelt plea from someone who cared profoundly. Camilla stepped away from the podium, relief washing over her. She had done what was needed. Whether her words would inspire action remained to be seen. But she had honored her husband's work and spoken her own truth. That was all anyone could do. Behind the scenes, staff breathed collective sighs of relief. The Queen had exceeded all expectations. Social media erupted with praise for her address. News organizations scrambled to analyze her proposals. The summit had found renewed energy from an unexpected source. Officer Whitmore watched the speech on a security monitor. He felt pride in serving an institution that produced such leadership. The Queen had demonstrated grace under pressure. She had stepped forward when needed without seeking the spotlight. It reminded him of why he had chosen this career. Camilla returned to her husband's room immediately after the speech. Charles was sitting up, tears streaming down his face. He told her she had been magnificent, that she had captured everything he felt but expressed it more beautifully. She had given voice to his heart and soul. They sat together in silence, holding hands. Outside, the summit continued. Negotiators worked on draft agreements incorporating ideas from both royal speeches. Momentum was building toward substantive commitments. Something special was happening. As evening approached, doctors reported. The fifth day of the summit began with cautious optimism. Negotiations had continued late into the previous night, fueled by momentum from the Queen's address. Several breakthrough agreements seemed within reach. The finish line was visible, though challenges remained. King Charles was feeling stronger. His doctors had adjusted medications and proper rest had helped. He insisted on attending at least part of the day's proceedings. Camilla worried but understood his need to be present. They compromised. He would attend the afternoon session only, limiting his time and energy expenditure. Officer Whitmore arrived for his shift to find unusual activity near the main entrance. A protest group had gathered outside the palace gates. They were climate activists demanding even stronger action from world leaders. Their signs and chants were passionate but peaceful. Police monitored the situation carefully. The morning session focused on enforcement mechanisms. Many previous climate agreements had failed because countries ignored their commitments without consequence. How could this summit create accountability? The discussions became heated as nations defended their sovereignty against international oversight. The Chinese delegation argued forcefully against external monitoring. The United States countered that transparency was essential for building trust. European leaders proposed compromise language that balanced both concerns. Progress was slow and frustrating, but it was progress. Camilla spent the morning working through correspondence. Messages had poured in from around the world praising her speech. Former prime ministers, environmental leaders, and ordinary citizens wrote expressing gratitude. She read each one carefully, touched by the response. One letter particularly moved her. It came from a young girl in Bangladesh whose family had been displaced by flooding. The girl thanked the Queen for speaking about people like her. She wrote that feeling seen and heard gave her hope. Camilla wiped away tears reading those words. She realized something important. Her speech had not just been about policy or politics. It had been about recognition, about acknowledging the human beings behind the statistics and projections. Sometimes that acknowledgement mattered as much as material assistance. People needed to know their suffering was seen. At noon, Commander Pembroke conducted a security briefing. The peaceful protest outside was growing. Media coverage was extensive. Some activists were camping overnight, planning to maintain presence through the summit's conclusion. The commander assessed no immediate threat but increased precautions. Officer Whitmore was assigned to a roving patrol. He walked the palace perimeter, observing the protesters through the gates. Their dedication impressed him. They stood in cold rain, holding soggy signs, believing their voices mattered. He thought about different forms of service and sacrifice. Inside, lunch discussions buzzed with energy. The German chancellor had proposed a radical new funding mechanism that caught everyone's attention. It would create a global climate bank funded by carbon taxes on the world's largest corporations. The proposal was ambitious and controversial. Developing nations embraced the idea enthusiastically. It represented the kind of systemic change they had long demanded. Wealthy nations were more cautious, concerned about economic impacts. But nobody dismissed it outright. The proposal had momentum and would require serious consideration. King Charles prepared for his afternoon appearance. He dressed carefully with Camilla's help. His hands were steadier today, his color better. He was determined to show strength and commitment. He would not let his health become a distraction from the summit's important work. At 2 o'clock, word spread that the king would attend the closing negotiations. Camera crews rushed to position themselves. World leaders straightened in their seats. There was something powerful about his presence after his near collapse. It demonstrated dedication that inspired others. Charles entered the conference hall to sustained applause. He looked thinner than just days before, but his smile was genuine and warm. He took his seat beside Camilla, reaching for her hand. The gesture was brief but noticed. Their partnership was evident to everyone watching. The afternoon session tackled the most contentious remaining issues. How much money would wealthy nations commit to climate adaptation? Would emerging economies accept binding emissions limits? Could they agree on timeline benchmarks that were both ambitious and realistic? Every detail mattered. The Indian delegation raised concerns about energy poverty. They could not deny hundreds of millions of people access to electricity, while wealthy nations maintained their comfortable lifestyles. The point was valid and uncomfortable. How could the world balance environmental protection with human development needs? A South African representative offered perspective from her continent. Africa had contributed least to climate change but suffered disproportionately from its effects. Yet African nations were expected to forego fossil fuel development, while already developed nations dragged their feet on funding alternatives. The inequity was stark and undeniable. King Charles requested permission to speak informally. The session chair granted it immediately. Charles stood slowly, steadying himself with one hand on the table. The room fell completely silent. Everyone leaned forward to hear his words. He spoke about the protests outside the palace. He had watched news coverage of young activists standing in the rain. They represented a generation that would inherit the consequences of decisions made today. He admitted feeling ashamed that his generation had left them such a burden. He challenged the assembled leaders to think beyond political calculations. They were there not as representatives of nations but as trustees of the planet. History would remember them not for protecting narrow interests but for their courage or lack thereof. This was their moment to choose. Charles acknowledged the complexity of the issues. He understood the competing pressures every leader faced, but he insisted that complexity could not justify inaction. They must find ways to balance competing needs while protecting the planet's future. That was the hard work of leadership. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, passion overcoming physical weakness. He quoted climate scientists, indigenous leaders, and young activists. He referenced specific proposals under discussion, showing his detailed knowledge. This was not ceremonial speaking. He was actively engaging with the substance. When he finished, the room erupted in applause once again. But this time something else happened. The French president stood and announced a doubling of his nation's climate financing commitment. The Canadian Prime Minister followed, pledging faster emissions reductions than previously planned. One by one, leaders began making concrete new commitments. Camilla watched in astonishment. Her husband had somehow catalyzed a moment of collective courage. Leaders were moving beyond cautious positions, making bolder pledges. The summit's outcome was being transformed in real time. Years of advocacy and this moment of moral clarity were combining to create change. The German chancellor proposed that they suspend formal negotiations and instead engage in open dialogue about what was truly possible. Other leaders agreed. For the next 2 hours, they spoke candidly about their constraints and their aspirations. It was unprecedented and powerful. Officer Whitmore heard about what was happening from other guards monitoring the proceedings. Something special was occurring inside that conference hall. He thought about how small moments could create large impacts. His own vigilance days earlier, the Queen's speech yesterday, the King's words today, individual actions rippling outward. The protesters outside sensed the changing atmosphere. News reached them through social media about new commitments being announced. Their chants became more celebratory. They had maintained pressure, and it seemed to be working. Their voices had been heard after all. As evening approached, exhausted negotiators took a break. They had made more progress in these few hours than in the previous days combined. Draft agreements were being rapidly revised to reflect new ambitions. Staff scrambled to incorporate the flood of new commitments. Camilla insisted Charles return to rest. He protested, but she was firm. He had given everything he could for today. Now he must preserve energy for tomorrow's closing ceremony. Charles finally agreed, too tired to argue effectively. As they left the conference hall, applause followed them. World leaders stood in respect and gratitude. The royal couple had created space for something extraordinary to happen. Their personal courage had inspired collective bravery. Back in their private apartments, Charles collapsed into a chair. The effort had depleted him, but satisfaction showed on his face. He had done what he needed to do. Whatever happened with his health, this moment would stand. He had made a difference when it mattered most. Camilla ordered dinner for them both, though neither was hungry. They ate mechanically, too exhausted for conversation. Outside their windows, London sparkled with evening lights. The rain had stopped. Stars were visible for the first time in days. Officer Whitmore completed his shift and returned to his quarters. He had witnessed something extraordinary during his time at this summit. He had learned that duty sometimes meant speaking uncomfortable truths. That vigilance took many forms. That courage could be quiet or loud but was always essential. He thought about the young activists outside the gates, the Queen's compassionate address, the King's passionate. The final day of the Global Climate Summit arrived with brilliant sunshine. The weather felt symbolic, as if nature itself was offering hope. Inside Buckingham Palace, staff moved with purposeful energy, preparing for the closing ceremony. This day would determine whether the summit would be remembered as transformative or disappointing. Queen Camilla woke early, checking on Charles before doing anything else. He was already awake, sitting up and reading the morning papers. The coverage was extraordinary. Headlines proclaimed a breakthrough in climate negotiations. Editorials praised the unexpected leadership shown by the royal couple. The world was watching to see how it would end. Officer Whitmore reported for what he knew would be his last shift during the summit. The experience had changed him in ways he was still processing. He had learned that following instincts mattered, that speaking up was sometimes the hardest and most important form of duty. He wondered if he would ever be part of something so significant again. The morning began with final negotiations on the summit's concluding declaration. Every word was debated, every commitment scrutinized. Legal advisors from dozens of nations worked to ensure the language was both ambitious and achievable. The document would set international climate policy for the next decade. At 9 o'clock, something unexpected happened. The young climate activists who had been protesting outside requested a meeting with Queen Camilla. They wanted to present her with a letter signed by youth activists from 90 countries. Palace staff were unsure how to respond. Protest groups did not typically receive royal audiences. Camilla made a quick decision. She would meet with them. Her staff worried about protocol and precedent. She dismissed their concerns with a smile. These young people had stood in the rain for days, advocating for their future. The least she could do was hear them. Besides, she told her advisors, sometimes protocol needed to bend to humanity. 20 activists were ushered into a palace meeting room. They were nervous and excited, awed by their surroundings. Camilla entered and immediately put them at ease with her warm demeanor. She invited them to sit and asked them to share their letter and their concerns. She listened intently, taking notes. The letter was powerful. It thanked the Queen for her speech, but emphasized that words must translate to action. Young people around the world were watching. They needed to see genuine commitment, not just diplomatic language. They needed their leaders to act with the urgency the science demanded. The letter was respectful but firm. It did not plead. It demanded. Camilla was deeply moved. She told the young activists that they reminded her why this work mattered. She acknowledged their frustration and fear. She could not promise perfect outcomes, but she pledged to continue advocating for strong climate action. She asked them to hold leaders accountable, to never stop pushing for more. Their voices were essential. One young woman from a Pacific island nation spoke about watching her homeland disappear into the ocean. She described helping her grandmother evacuate from their family home as waters rose. She spoke without anger, just profound sadness. Her story left everyone in the room silent. The Queen reached across and took the young woman's hand. She had no words that could ease that pain. But human connection mattered. Recognition mattered. She promised to share the young woman's story with the assembled leaders. Some truths needed to be heard directly, not filtered through diplomatic language. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. As the activists left, several wiped away tears. They had not expected such genuine engagement. Camilla had treated them as equals, as people whose perspectives mattered. It was a small gesture with profound impact. They left feeling heard and valued. Commander Pembroke had observed the meeting from a respectful distance. She thought about how leadership could take unexpected forms. The Queen had broken protocol to connect with young protesters. That took a different kind of courage than military valor, but it was courage nonetheless. She made a mental note to speak with Officer Whitmore about what she had learned from watching him and the Queen this week. At 11 o'clock, world leaders gathered for the summit's final session. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Would they sign the ambitious declaration that had been drafted, or would last-minute objections water it down? Everything they had worked toward hung in the balance. King Charles entered with Camilla at his side. He moved slowly but with determination. His presence sent a message. Despite his health challenges, he was there to see this through. Several leaders approached to quietly express admiration for his dedication. He thanked them but deflected attention to the important work at hand. The session chair reviewed the final declaration. It contained unprecedented commitments on emissions reductions, climate financing, and technology transfer. It established accountability mechanisms and regular review processes. It was more ambitious than anyone had thought possible just a week earlier. The question was whether every nation would sign. One by one, leaders were asked to indicate their positions. The smaller nations signed immediately, having the most to lose from inaction. European nations committed their support. China and the United States, after brief consultation between their delegations, also agreed. The room held its breath as each successive nation added their commitment. When the final signatures were secured, applause erupted. Staff members who had worked around the clock on negotiations embraced. Leaders shook hands across traditional divides. Something extraordinary had been achieved. Not perfect, but meaningful and real. A foundation had been laid for the hard work ahead. Charles felt tears on his cheeks. He did not try to hide them. This represented decades of advocacy coming to fruition. It was more than he had hoped for when he convened the summit. His health challenges suddenly seemed insignificant compared to this achievement. He had lived to see real progress on the cause that defined his life. Camilla squeezed his hand, sharing his emotion. She understood what this meant to him. She had witnessed his lonely struggle when environmental advocacy was considered eccentric. She had seen him persist through ridicule and dismissal. Today validated all of it. His life's work had made a difference. The closing ceremony included brief speeches from key participants. The German chancellor spoke movingly about collective responsibility. The representative from the Maldives thanked those who had listened to vulnerable nations. Each speaker emphasized that signing the declaration was just the beginning. Implementation would require sustained effort and political will. When King Charles was invited to offer closing remarks, he stood with Camilla's help. He spoke briefly, his voice thick with emotion. He thanked everyone for their hard work and commitment. He acknowledged that perfect solutions were impossible, but meaningful progress was within reach. He challenged everyone to honor their commitments when political pressures mounted. The planet could not wait. He shared what the young activist had told Camilla that morning. He spoke about the young woman watching her homeland sink into the ocean. He urged leaders to remember her face, her story, her pain. Climate change was not abstract. It was real people losing real homes. That human dimension must never be forgotten. His final words were simple but powerful. He said future generations would look back on this moment. They would judge whether the assembled leaders had shown courage or cowardice, wisdom or foolishness. The choice was theirs, and history was watching. With those words, he sat down to thunderous applause. The ceremony concluded with a formal group photograph. World leaders assembled on the palace steps, the signed declaration held prominently in the center. Cameras captured the moment from every angle. This image would define the summit in public memory. It represented hope and commitment to a better future. As dignitaries departed, staff began the massive task of dismantling the summit infrastructure. In just hours, the palace would return to normal operations. But nothing was truly normal anymore. Something had shifted. A moment of collective courage had created new possibilities. Officer Whitmore watched the final departures from his post. He had played a small role in keeping everyone safe, allowing the important work to happen. He felt proud of his contribution, however modest. Service was about enabling others to do great things, he realized. That was enough. Commander Pembroke found him as his shift ended. She thanked him formally for his exemplary service during the summit. Then she did something unexpected. She told him that his willingness to trust his instincts and speak up had reminded her why they served. Sometimes the rule book was less important than doing what was right. She had learned from watching him, and she would not forget it. That evening, the King and Queen hosted a private dinner for senior staff who had made the summit possible. It was informal and relaxed, a chance to celebrate together away from cameras. Charles moved slowly but happily among the guests, thanking each person individually. Camilla matched his effort, ensuring no one felt overlooked. During the dinner, Charles made an unscheduled announcement. He asked Officer Whitmore to stand. He explained to the gathered staff about the guards' vigilance and courage. He said that Officer Whitmore embodied the best qualities of service: dedication, integrity, and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. He presented him with a royal commendation, a rare honor for someone so junior. "Officer,"